Just a quick announcement-y thing before the video begins. I was planning to bring out the second large documentary like the Agincourt one as the second video on this channel and start doing weekly videos from there, but it's taking far longer than expected, so I'm going to start the weekly videos now and keep working on the next big documentary in the background. Anyway, into the video. History is full of awesome stories of people pulling all sorts of tricks to get all sorts of things done. And while the title of history's greatest trickster is very subjective and subject to change, this guy is one hell of a deceiver. In fact, he's so good he may not even have existed at all. He almost certainly did though, but it's very tricky to pull apart what he actually did and what he actually didn't do. The man in question is Zhuge Liang, born in 181 AD in the modern-day Ishui County in China. Zhuge grew up as a poet, a singer, and a part-time prophet, but in 207, tales of his talent reached men of higher importance. It's believed that it took the great warlord and future self-proclaimed emperor Liu Bei 3 visits to Zhuge Liang's hovel to persuade him to come. According to legend, Zhuge slammed the door in the warlord's face the first time, and by the third, he had his bags packed and a plan to conquer China. After Liu Bei had to flee from where he was taking refuge after the successor of who he was taking refuge with immediately surrendered to his enemy Cao Cao, Zhuge Liang was tasked with creating some form of alliance between Liu Bei and Sun Quan. He cleverly persuaded Sun Quan that there was little point in not allying against Cao Cao if he was not going to surrender to him. And after one of Sun Quan's generals pointed out some of Cao Cao's weaknesses, Sun Quan agreed to the alliance. But perhaps the most brilliant stories about Zhuge Liang are the ones that are far more likely not to be true, which is disappointing. However, despite many disregarding all of these as completely false, there are some different sources that claim the legitimacy of some of these stories, so many could be, in part at least, true. It certainly seems like some have more credibility than others. One of the most widely believed stories about Zhuge Liang is his many battles against the rebel warlord Men Hu, after Liu Bei had died. While there is some doubt to his relatively short rivalry with Zhuge Liang and even his existence, there are still some in China who worship Men Hu as one of their natural rulers. Liang's military capability was not one that could be bested by the supposed brutality of a mere mortal like Men Hu, and it didn't take long to have him captured at Liang's feet. Enraged, Hu refused to surrender, so Liang let him go. It of course wasn't long until Hu was captured again, but still refused to surrender. It took 7 humiliating defeats and captures for Hu to finally surrender and pledge his allegiance to Shu, the faction that Liang served under. According to legend, Liang's first major military engagement at a high position, when Liu Bei was still alive, was the Battle of Boang. Liang sent out his new commander straight into the fray, and then had him retreat straight away at the first sign of danger. This was repeated until the enemy all but knew an ambush was on its way. Their commander, however, had the confidence to assume that if an ambush was required to have an advantage, Liu Bei's forces were weak enough to be defeated anyway. And so, when the predictable ambush came, it was fought off with relative ease. They pushed deeper into Liu Bei's lands, the emperor now nowhere to be seen. Miles down the road, still marching to the drums of victory, and at a narrow pass, Liang enacted his plan. Legend tells of fire surrounding the enemy, throwing them into a panic, leading to their slaughter in their most unfavourable terrain. Zhuge Liang had proved his worth. But in a situation like the one Liang was in, with all sorts trying to prove themselves to Liu Bei, Zhuge Liang's instant favour with the emperor was obviously met with jealousy of varying levels. When Liang first joined, the general Zhang Fei and the legendary warrior Guan Yu protested against the new, deepening relationship between Liu Bei and Zhuge Liang. But Liu Bei effectively told them to quit whining, and being the loyal men they were, quit whining they did. It wasn't quite as simple as that for Guan Yu, however, who was apparently furious after losing a poetry contest to Zhuge Liang. Being Liang's superior, he ordered him to have 100,000 arrows ready for him in 10 days' time, a ridiculous challenge given the resources available to Liang. If Liang couldn't produce these arrows, Guan Yu would have room to execute him for failure. Unfazed, Liang stated that he would bring the required amount of arrows in 3 days rather than 10. Using ships from Liu Bei's fleet, he placed straw men all over the ships and covered the ships themselves with straw. Using a minimal crew, he sailed to one of Cao Cao's heavily defended castles and prepared to attack. Hearing the drums of war from the other side of their walls, Cao Cao's garrison rained arrows down onto the ships towards the outlines of the men they could see on them, hoping to shred the invading army before they could reach the castle. Zhuge Liang simply turned around once he was satisfied with the amount of arrows stuck in the straw around his ships, and returned to Guan Yu with nearly 200,000 arrows. Now, these last two stories probably aren't true, but I'll come back to that later. This one is more likely not to be true than not, but seems to hold more credibility than the other two and does mirror similar tactics used throughout history. Zhuge Liang's last great enemy that he would fight until his death to illness in 234 was Xian Yi. Yi had command of a far greater resource pool than Liang, and often used this to his advantage. While Liang was on the back foot and on the retreat, he reached a walled town, where he knew that Xian Yi would soon catch up. So Liang sent the townsfolk and most of his army to safety, but they weren't going to get away unless Liang could buy them time. Far from a man to simply sacrifice himself or his men to aid a retreat, Liang used his reputation that he had built for himself over many years as a weapon against Yi. When Xian Yi's grand army of 100,000 arrived at the town, they found the gates wide open and townsfolk sweeping the roads, and on top of that gate sat Zhuge Liang himself, playing a musical instrument. Different sources cite different instruments, so I'm going to imagine it was a tiny piano, despite the fact that pianos weren't invented yet. It was probably something like a guqin, or another type of zither. Xian Yi hesitated. It was most uncharacteristic of Liang to put himself in such a dangerous position. In fact, Zhuge Liang's reputation was so great that Yi ordered a full retreat. As soon as Yi's army was out of sight, Liang got up, probably took a moment to laugh at his enemy, and then ordered his remaining soldiers to take off their townfolk disguises, get on their horses, and join the rest of his army safe and sound. When Yi came storming back when he realised what had happened, Zhuge Liang's entire army had returned safely home after his campaign. Now, I've talked a lot about the reliability of some of these stories, and how a couple of them very probably aren't true. The problem with Zhuge Liang is that he is part of a period in China known as the Three Kingdoms period, referencing the three kingdoms of Wei, Shu and Wu, ruled by Cao Cao, Liu Bei and Sun Quan respectively. This period is surrounded in a ridiculous amount of myth and legend, to the point where some believe the entire thing is completely mythical. The main source of these myths is the 14th century novel called The Romance of the Three Kingdoms. This book was so influential that it's often really hard to separate the myth from the truth, and simply working it out based on sources written before isn't easy either, because so many of them are corrupted with myth as well. So many historians have claimed to have found the truth, or worked out what's myth and what's probably not myth, but they often disagree, so that doesn't help. It makes Wikipedia a big no when researching for this period, but even then, as I've said throughout, there's no way of really knowing. But there is something quite important that we can pull from behind the lines of the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. In the novel, Zhuge Liang is gifted with supernatural powers. He has mastered the art of I Ching, or throwing sticks onto the floor to predict the future. He prays for the wind to change favourably before the Battle of the Red Cliffs, so Zhou Yu's plan of sailing fire ships into Cao Cao's fleet could work, and he apparently tricks the gods into accepting dumplings instead of heads as a sacrifice. His supernatural abilities are a key to Zhuge Liang's mythology, and it seems that this extends beyond just the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. Because it's when we consider Liang's fantastical reputation that the raw truth behind the great myths surrounding him become obvious. Imagine you're as clever as Zhuge Liang in a time where people believed so deeply in what many people would now call superstitious irrationality. Simply being clever won't cut it as well as being able to see the future or change the winds. If you're clever enough, and given his reputation alone we can assume Liang was, you can use this to your advantage. Maybe the myths about him aren't true, but I would argue that Zhuge Liang could still be given the title of history's greatest trickster. By creating a mythos about you so great that an emperor visits you 3 times to ask for your help, by attributing your great deeds to favour with the gods or a connection with the other realms. Liang's greatest trick was tricking everyone into thinking he was capable of even greater feats than he was, not easy to disprove when he was nearly always the cleverest man in the room. If he existed. It is of course possible that some of these myths are merely legends, the truth warped into something more supernatural. For example, there is a story where Liang stopped an army in its tracks by confusing everyone with a labyrinth of stones. This story suddenly changes when we look at some of the inventions that Liang is credited with, an early form of landmine being one of them, a wheelbarrow type thing and a semi-automatic crossbow being a couple of others. Anyway, I do hope you enjoyed this video about a man that we're not sure existed at a time we're not sure happened, doing things that we're not sure whether he did or not. The inspiration from this and a lot of the base research came from a fantastic book I got last Christmas called History's Greatest Deceptions and Confidence Scams, which I will probably use for making videos in the future. So check it out if you want, and maybe even consider it as a Christmas present for someone special to you. Not that this video's sponsored or anything, I just thought it was only right to give credit where credit's due. As in all of our videos, either here or on the Benji Thomas channel, our sources are in the description if you want to do any further reading. If you enjoyed this video, do give us a like, and feel free to subscribe to us if you want to see more content like this relating to mainly history, but also political systems and English literature too. If you think someone else should have got the title of History's Greatest Trickster, let me know in the comments and I'll look them up for my own amusement. Maybe someone more recent for a bit of difference? Anyway, I do hope you did enjoy it, and I'll hopefully see you next week.